And sticking with transport, I think you guys are getting the bulk of the interrogation today, but I'm sure the other departments are probably happy about that. Just with respect to the ZEVI, the Zero Emission Vehicles Office, does its remit include bikes and cargo bikes and trikes and so on, Mr. Martin? Or is it Ms. O'Grady?
That's Ms. O'Grady, but I think the answer may well be no, and it'll land firmly back in my own lap, but I'll pass over to Eva.
So it's zero emission vehicles, but it's really just electric vehicles, electric cars, okay.
It's electric cars or motorbikes. So at the moment, I think our working assumption it's vehicles that need to be registered and licensed. Okay. And the reason for that is, I mean, it may develop further, but the infrastructure needs which you would need for those vehicles, for cars, vans, say, and motorbikes, and the kind of the Italian scooter as opposed to the e-scooter that we're talking about now, is a very different type of charging infrastructure than when we're talking about e-bikes and e-scooters. Their infrastructure needs, I think, are much more aligned with sustainable mobility needs, and actually the charging for them is insignificant. So if we're the infrastructure that the Zero Emission Vehicle Ireland office, the ZEVI office, would be looking at, would be that kind of large-scale charging infrastructure. And my own feeling is that the infrastructure challenge for e-scooters and e-bikes is much more on the sustainable mobility side than the electric charging side.
Okay, but then against that, Mr. Grady, electric vehicles aren't quite zero emission vehicles. You know, there's still a residual carbon cost. You know, if we get to 80% renewables by 2030, which would be brilliant if we do, it's still 20% will be fossil fuels powering those vehicles. And of course, while not part of the accounting system, there's the embodied emissions associated with electric vehicles as well. So I don't think it's correct that it would be called the Zero Emission Vehicle Office, because it isn't that and can't be that. I want to ask about the vehicle kilometre reduction target for fossil fuel vehicles. It's 10%. Now, it seems to me that that's pretty meaningless in the context of the target of 850,000 electric vehicles by 2030. So we should easily eclipse the 10% for vehicle kilometre reduction for ICE vehicles. So really, shouldn't that target, if it's for fossil fuel vehicles, it should be a lot higher. And if it's not higher, then are we saying that we're not going to achieve that in the first instance? But are we not being true to the avoid, shift, improve principle if we're not applying it to total number of kilometres driven? And if we're not applying it to total kilometres driven, then are we saying that there'll be an equal or greater number of kilometres driven by vehicles in 2030, when obviously with the avoid, shift, improve approach, we want to get people onto other modes first and foremost, reduce the need for driving? You might just address that. It's probably Ms. O'Grady, is it?
I can jump in, and Aoife may want to jump in after that if that's okay. I mean, one thing we do have to remember here is that this is measured against the baseline in 2018. So we're looking at a reduction of 10% in total kilometres driven by fossil fuel cars of 10% as compared against 2018. But that has to also counter the level of growth that we will see between now and 2030, which is not insignificant. So while the growth will be increasing, we're also trying to drive
we could have more
fossil fuel kilometres down.
Okay.
It's important to note as well that this is total kilometres. So bear in mind that, say, for example, some of the public transport journeys or the active transport journeys that we're trying to promote would be typically for shorter journeys. And you still will have people driving much longer journeys in their own private cars. And in many cases, rightly so, there may not be an alternative to that. So that total count of kilometres is still impacted in the context of private car use. The third thing to say there is that the average length over which an ICE or a fossil fuel car is on the road, I think, is about 14 years. So even though we're looking at a fairly significant number of EVs on the road by 2030, a total of 940 when you look at light vans as well, you still will have a lot of cars that have been sold in the years up to that point, which are fossil fuel cars, and they will remain on the road even after fossil fuel cars cease to be sold at all. You will have this residual. So that 10% kilometre reduction, while on first glance it does appear to be quite a small reduction, all the modelling that we have done and all the analysis that we've done, even looking at the modal shift from cars to active travel, cars to public transport, and the transition from ICE cars to EVs, it is still quite an ambitious target. But if we meet that, then we're well on our way to meeting the abatement targets that we've set out in COP21.
If I'm hearing you correctly, we could have more cars and more kilometres driven on our roads by 2030. That's correct, based on growth.
We're looking to reduce. I mean, obviously, one of the bodies of work that the department is doing is around demand management, where we're trying to reduce the overall reliance on private car use. And that's obviously something that we're committed to, and we're looking at a whole range of measures to try and achieve that.
But if you're committed to it,
there are still a number of journeys that will have to be made by cars, and the growth factors that we're looking at in terms of population. It will be that continuous counterbalance between increased growth and reduction in the number of car journeys that we're achieving through the measures and policies that we're trying to put in place.
Okay, thanks for your answers. But I think if you're committed to it, then it makes sense that you would have, if you're committed to demand management and reduction and avoid, shift, improve. And avoid, shift, improve is really about electric vehicles where you can't, you've no other way of providing the transport needs of the population. If you're really committed to it, then you will have a much larger target, either for fossil fuel vehicles or a total target as well. So it doesn't sound like the commitment is there as far as I can hear.
Hi, Chair, if I might come in there, I guess the focus on the 10% reduction isn't a sustainable mobility target per se or a demand management target per se, it's a carbon counting mechanism. So what we modelled was what we could do under biofuels, sustainable renewable fuels, the reduction that would give us in carbon emissions, what would be achieved through carbon emissions reduction through greater uptake of EVs, what will be delivered through our sustainable transport investment over the years between now and 2030. And then in order to get to 51%, what the modelling shows us is, I'm sorry, this isn't even in order to get to 51%. What the modelling shows us is that a 10% reduction in ICE car kilometres will reduce further carbon emissions. There's still a 0.9 megatonne gap to target, and the work that Andrea referenced earlier on is identifying a way to deliver that 0.9 megatonne additional reduction, which in the least negative impact in terms of distributional impact. So we're trying to, as a department, we're trying to identify that final pathway that will do it in as beneficial a way for society and economy as possible. But that 10% demand management kilometres reduction, it's defined as an ICE kilometre reduction because the aim of it is carbon reduction. There may well be electric vehicle kilometre reduction in there also, but that doesn't count towards our carbon reduction target, if you see what I'm saying.
Because you're counting electric vehicles as zero emissions. On a sustainable mobility side, we could absolutely go further on demand management, but it's within the climate action plan and it's in there as a carbon counting mechanism as opposed to a broader sustainable mobility mechanism. Okay, sticking with the carbon counting, you're counting electric vehicles as zero emissions. In terms of accounting, in terms of the transport sector, that's just to do with the way that the country accounting works. The energy from them is accounted for in the energy emission sector, so they are zero tailpipe emissions, and the transport sector's emissions calculation comes from fuel sold in the country. So if and that's petrol and diesel fuel. So if they are using electricity
and that electricity is 80% renewable, that 20% renewables is counted for in the electricity and energy side rather than in the transport side. So that's just I agree with you. They're not fully zero emission in that way, but they're zero tailpipe emissions, and transport tends to count the tailpipe emissions in terms of carbon accounting.
Okay, can I ask you just about the modelling and the gap that's there, the 0.9 megatons in transport? There was a study there, I think it was earlier this year maybe, or late last year, by researchers in UCC that showed that 40% or nearly 40% of our transport emissions were caused by private car journeys of the 0 to 8 kilometre range. Now, a lot of these are commutes, a lot of them are school run, going to the shops, mass and so on. But that 0 to 8 kilometre range is really, it's certainly for the lower end of it, you're talking about potential for cycling, and there is very good work being done, certainly. The upper end of it is certainly within the potential for e-bikes. And I'm just wondering, is the modelling appropriately accounting for the potential of e-bike uptake? And I am concerned that the office isn't looking at e-bikes as, and actually they're not even fully zero emission either, because they still require power, but they're certainly much closer to zero emission vehicles than your typical electric vehicles. So is the modelling, is it accounting for the potential for electric bike uptake for those, let's say, the 3 to 8 kilometre range of journeys?
Just on the specifics of the modelling, if I can come in there, I'm not sure on the e-bikes, and we can come back to you specifically on that. But the exercise that we undertook this year, it's the NTA and Sistra who do the transport model. We have looked at that question of reducing ICE kilometres in particular. We had 4 workshops, and that was one of them. So one of the key things actually we looked at there was around car ownership, and there could be measures there to kind of look at multiple car owners and reducing that in areas, and also trips themselves, and differentiating, as you speak about there, the shorter trips and the longer trips. There is a different demand response that's there. So those kind of things are being taken into account in terms of the review on modelling. So, as I said, the results of that will be very soon in the summer, and hopefully that will inform our thinking. We also have another study that's being carried out on e-bikes. It's a co-funded project with the SEAI, and there will be an output of that as well, which will inform our thinking on that area. But part of that review process that we did in the workshops was to involve academics, policymakers, modellers, to really look afresh at the model and see where we can get the gains. It's primarily to address that 0.9 megaton gap that we have, but to look again at the balance of the measures, and are we really hitting all the various measures that we can to achieve the overall goal.
But thank you for that. And it's not even, it's more than the 0.9 really, because like a lot of the journeys that we envisage that will be made by the 845,000 electric vehicles, a lot of them could be actually by more sustainable modes again. So the potential there is actually vast, and I'm not saying it's necessarily straightforward. I mean, we have to build the networks in all our villages and our towns and our cities so that people can feel safe getting onto a bike or an e-bike or an e-cargo bike. But it seems that if we accept that the potential there is huge, because anything in that 0 to 8 kilometre range is very cyclable, comfortably cyclable. Then we probably wouldn't need to be so ambitious in the electric vehicle target, which is, as I think everybody would agree, very ambitious and indeed very costly to the state as well. Conscious of time.
Can I jump in on the e-bikes there, if that's okay? Just very quickly to pick up on that point. I mean, the modelling that we have includes what's referred to as a cycling propensity factor, which is in essence how likely are people to cycle and over what distance, so we can ramp that up and ramp that down. Obviously, the uptake in e-bikes over the last couple of years has increased very quickly, and we're seeing, thankfully, a huge number of e-bikes on the road, particularly after COVID, when the supply chain issues around e-bikes began to loosen out and the prices came down. I mean, if you were having this conversation maybe 3 years ago, you would have seen a fraction of the e-bikes on the road that we're seeing now. And I think it's an evolving technology. We're seeing more of it. You're getting much cheaper e-bikes into the market. Brands like, well, I won't name brands, but there are much cheaper ones coming into the market where you can buy e-bikes for less than €1,500 now, which you couldn't 2 or 3 years ago. So it is very much a developing area. It is something that I think we need to react to. Whether the modelling that was done for CAP 21 or not fully incorporated the potential of people to replace those longer 5 kilometre to 8 kilometre journeys with e-bikes or not, I can't answer directly here, and it is something that can certainly be looked at. But these are the sorts of things, and we've recognised in the carbon budgets and in the timing of the carbon budgets that new technologies will be coming along, and that we will need to have to respond and adapt to new technologies and try and harness the benefits that they can give us as and when they do come along. And I think this is a perfect example of that.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Martin. I do have a few more questions. If members don't mind, I'll just push through with them. The reference was made to EV uptake in Dublin, and a study or a scheme in Hackney in London was cited. And just to reiterate Senator O'Reilly's point, in our city centres, this is where we don't want the EVs because there's other ways of getting around. So we shouldn't be seeing it as a target or as an ambition that everybody in the city centre of Dublin or Limerick or should have an EV outside their front door. And if we do think like that, we're just going to clog our urban areas with cars. And I think we need to be cautious about providing that infrastructure and lampposts. That the streets in our villages and our towns need to be prioritised, not for on-street parking, but for active travel and sustainable travel infrastructure as well. So we just need to be very careful about that. But sticking with the EVs, and we might say that the justifiable use for EVs is in rural areas where it's very difficult to provide the public transport. But notwithstanding that, there's huge potential to provide, to go beyond Connecting Ireland, I would say, we've talked about it in this committee a number of times, actually, the every village, every hour concept. And it's not just every village, every hour. It needs to be a quick and reliable service as well. I see Deputy O'Sullivan was tweeting at the weekend about the local link down in Clonakilty, between Clonakilty and Kinsale. It was great to see you using it, Deputy. But I think we can very cost effectively really roll out that kind of service right across the country and go way beyond the 70% coverage that's in Connecting Ireland. And actually what we should be trying to do is provide a service not for people necessarily who, not just for people who can't afford cars or even electric vehicles, but simply for everybody because of the emissions cost that's associated with driving even with electric vehicles. And I'm wondering then, and referring back to others' points about, glad to see support across the committee for really ramping up the ambition in taxation for larger and heavier and inefficient vehicles. But I think you'd probably agree, Deputy Smith. Well, Deputy Farrell was actually very supportive of a big push, a big jump in taxes on the larger and heavier vehicles, and I certainly would agree with that. But can the revenues, has any study been done, the revenue that would be accrued from a ramping up in taxation, so that it is obscene that 55,000 vehicles last year were these huge tanks that are absolutely unnecessary. Like, some people might need them, but nothing like 55,000 people or families. So is there any analysis being done on the revenues from an exercise like that to increase taxation on those heavier inefficient vehicles to fund a more universal rural public transport service?
So there is analysis being, well, there's initial analysis being done at the moment. There's two pieces of work, I suppose. One is on how we can use the taxation system to incentivise lower emission vehicles and at the same time disincentivise the higher emission heavy vehicles. However, I would say that we're not, normally in Ireland, we don't hypothecate our taxation revenue. And so in terms of ring fencing a certain amount that comes in through, say, VRT on higher emitting very large vehicles and transferring that directly to support to ring fence around to support public transport in rural areas is something that I'm sure colleagues in the Department of Finance would be quite wary of. But what we do see is the two things happening, that the VRT is increasing on the higher emitting vehicles, and at the same time more funding is going in to promoting rural sustainable and public transport. So both initiatives are happening. The ring fencing of one or the other is probably more a matter for the Department of Finance, but as I said, hypothecation is a space that they tend to be reluctant to step into.
Yeah, okay, we'll bring in Department of Finance officials maybe for that one. Thank you for your answers, and apologies to colleagues for taking more than my allocated time. Deputy O'Rourke.